Welcome back to the channel. A lot to unpack this week, talking about what is happening with the Canadian government. Our government, or Liberal government, is losing members left, right, and center. We could be potentially facing an election in the next 8 to a couple of months from now, as I believe many Canadians and parliamentarians feel that the government is not supporting their needs. And there's definitely not a lot of confidence in our current administration. What does that mean as we head into January 20th, where we're going to see President-elect Donald Trump take office officially? Following that, we're going to have January 29th, the next Bank of Canada rate announcement. And that's going to be interesting with inflation here in Canada, headline inflation taken down to 1.9%, even though we had core, medium, and trim basically uptick a little bit. The economic backdrop here in Canada is really not looking too good. And, we'll want to get into it. We'll talk a little bit more about our opinions and what we see sort of happening over the next little while and what we're seeing happening right now on the ground floor with a lot of our clients when it comes to selecting their mortgage products, what we're seeing. So we welcome you back to the channel. If you have not subscribed, we invite you to subscribe to the channel. Don't forget to hit that notification bell and leave a question or comment in the comment section below. Let us know your thoughts and concerns down there. We want to hear what you have to say, but let's get right into the meat and potatoes. I mean, a lot happened this week. We have Chrystia Freeland, the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister of Finance, basically getting fired or quitting with, I believe, the fact that, hey, she's not really happy with Trudeau. And then you have Sean Fraser, the Minister of Housing, recently appointed over the last, I think, year, basically saying, you know what, we're done. I'm done. Many people do not support Trudeau and the Trudeau administration. I mean, that's based on the polls. A lot of people just don't like the current government. They feel that they haven't, or the current Liberal government has not done anything to make them better or feel better. I mean, we look at the broader economy over the last 9 years. Obviously, yes, there's been a major pandemic. We definitely had inflation concerns, but we have definite deficit spending. I mean, just looking at the most recent tabled budget being blown out of the water, the guardrails basically just, not even existent, $61 billion deficit. I mean, it just goes to tell us epic proportions of what's happening in the government. They're not really conscientious with our money as taxpayers. And I think a lot of parliamentarians are just jumping ship. A lot of them are basically asking Trudeau to resign, basically leave. And, the narcissist Justin Trudeau just doesn't want to leave right now. I mean, ultimately, he's sinking his own party. And this will basically allow a new party, when the time comes to go to the ballots, to come into power, hopefully forming a majority government that is going to be potentially conservatives, with Pierre Poilievre leading the charge here. And whether you like that or, maybe don't like that, at the end of the day, the majority of Canadians just don't want the existing administration, Liberals in power. They want something new or someone better. And now we'll see what happens when we get to the polls. But ultimately, this leads us into the next conversation is now with Donald Trump, with the threats of these potential 25% tariffs coming in on January 20th. Well, who's going to handle this? I mean, basically there's pretty much going to be a non-confidence in the government. Who's going to be handling this, mediation with Donald Trump and his team about what's going to happen? Is Trump going to allow, a little bit of time as Canada gets their shit together? We've just basically, we've seen Trump trolling Trudeau, trolling Chrystia Freeland, basically saying, Canada's going to become the 51st state, Governor Trudeau. I think he's joking with that stuff. I mean, many Canadians apparently feel that they want to become the 51st state. I don't know. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. But realistically speaking, I think it's just Donald Trump saying, hey, look at the shit show that's happening in Canada. And, this just makes him look more resilient. And hopefully, we're going to see the spend, go to the border. Hopefully Donald Trump acknowledges that $1.3 billion spend with Canadian Border Services and everything else that's going to come with that, giving RCMP officials a little bit more power. Hopefully Trump sees that as a win. We'll see what happens the next little while. But ultimately, as the Canadian government, I believe, will be dissolved very quickly, basically non-confident over the next little while as they're taking their break. we have to really think about what the Bank of Canada is going to do on January 29th. And ultimately, for those of you who've been following the channel for quite some time, we've talked about the divergence in the Canadian and the US economy, how the US economy has stayed and continued to show its resilience, its strength when it comes to all different components. Basically juxtapose them between the Canada and US, everything that the US is doing well and doing poorly at, Canada is doing just all poorly at all different buckets. I mean, there's really nothing here in Canada to really talk about in the sense that, okay, well, we have unemployment taken up to 6.8%. We're not creating the jobs that we need for all the people that had arrived here, let alone the people that potentially may be leaving. That's really a good question. We have basically a major problem when it comes to growth in the economy right now, as we've basically inflated the numbers of growth through using people, new to Canada arrivals, to make that number or bolster that number up to make it look better than it really is. And now, if these people leave, well, we're not going to see the growth hit any remote target that the Bank of Canada and the government is setting. And that just basically leads to the fact that the Bank of Canada, who obviously the governor, more importantly, the governor of the Bank of Canada actually talked earlier this week in Vancouver about many different components, one of them being obviously the Canadian US dollar, what's happening there. And I really think that the Bank of Canada is really not concerned with the fact that, hey, the Canadian dollar, the loonie is weakening to the strength of the US dollar. And obviously, this could be inflationary. The Bank of Canada governor also talking about the 2% target in this meeting and basically saying that they're going to have to revisit a lot of these different components. And, with other central bank heads, is 2% the right target? Should it be 2.5? Should it be 3%? I mean, that is really the question as we look at major headwinds to inflation moving forward. So you might be saying, well, why don't we just move the inflation target to 3% and then be done with this? Why did the Bank of Canada have to go from pretty much zero to 500 basis point increase in the span of like 18 months? I mean, this is just absolutely bonkers if they could do that. And the question is ultimately the economic push factors or pull factors, depending on how you want to look at it, where we have a lot of deglobalization, a lot of products, a lot of trade that was dependent on other countries may be onshore back onto North American soil. That's going to cost more. Labor here is more. Obviously, things that we're accustomed to buying that are much cheaper might be more expensive. I mean, these are some major issues. And obviously, inflation, for the most part, according to the Bank of Canada governor, most heads of central banks, including the Fed, believe that inflation will remain steady at 2%. We've basically overcome the inflation saga for the time being. Now, with that being said, where does that leave us here in Canada? It does leave us with the fact that we have all these issues we talked about: unemployment, immigration, we have weak growth, poor GDP, Canadian government, a Liberal government that's failing, deficit spending, Canadians, consumers not that eager to go out and spend because they don't have the money. They're just highly levered. There's so much debt in the system, and we need to somehow unleverage that. We need to somehow bail out the Canadian consumer by lowering those interest rates, getting Canadians back reaching into their pockets to go spend in the economy. And, looking at the interest rate, the policy rate here at 3.25%, versus what's happening in the US, where the US doesn't really need to cut. I mean, this week they cut just to basically, move the policy rate, their Fed's fund rate, into a less restrictive territory to actually bring in more sentiment, more capital, more activity, more business, especially as we get into the new year. Once Trump is brought into power, I mean, what is his policy, deregulation, stock market, he's looking at basically making things easier. He wants to focus in on business and growth in the US, strengthening the US. Remember, he was elected on the border and he was elected on the economy. And, he, as a second, term president coming back in, he's a little bit more seasoned. I think he will deliver on those promises. Whether he leaves Canada and Mexico in the dust, and that impacts us here, will be yet to be determined. But at the end of the day, he's going to focus in on the US and what needs to be done there, just as we need to focus in on what needs to happen here in Canada. We just don't have anybody that I think capable enough to actually take the helm at the current moment. We need an election to happen. We need a new change in administration. Whether that's going to be Pierre Poilievre or not, let me know what you think in the comment section below. But all this uncertainty basically leads a lot of Canadians to maybe go back to the sidelines, or we're seeing a lot of Canadians coming off the sidelines, getting into their homes, right? Those single family homes, those towns, those semis, those detached homes, we're starting to see that activity pick up once again, whether that means higher prices, like the Bank of Canada Deputy Governor pointed out, and we talked about last week. More activity doesn't necessarily mean higher home prices just yet, but that means that could change in the next little while. A lot of Canadians with the Bank of Canada still leading down this road to cutting rates even in January. I don't believe we'll see 50 basis points, especially on the fact that the Bank of Canada governor has talked about gradual easing now. What's happening in the US as those headwinds or tailwinds sort of bleed over here into Canada. We just have to understand what happens in the US will determine what happens here in Canada. We can't see our dollar, our spread between the Fed's fund rate and our policy rate get too large. That's going to impact our Canadian dollar. But as I've mentioned, take it from me. I mean, this is what we're hearing. This is what we're hearing from other economists, many other analysts. The Bank of Canada governor is just, and the central bank here in Canada is just willing to sacrifice the Canadian dollar to maintain the Canadian economy. We need to get the Canadian economy back up and running. And if that means, hey, we're going to see a dollar at 60 cents or 65 cents, so be it. I mean, that's what's going to happen. Yes, of course, that will import inflation. Yes, that's going to make the cost of goods and services, food, a little bit more expensive, especially as we enter the winter months and we buy a lot of our produce from the US. But that also means that other things potentially could get a little bit cheaper here in Canada. Ultimately, it's a give and take. There's going to be some things that are going to get more expensive, some things that are going to come down in price. We'll see how all that plays out. But ultimately, I want to leave the video here. I said, just went off on a rant talking about what's happening right now. Let me know your thoughts and opinions in the comments section below. But I want to take this opportunity to wish all our viewers and supporters and subscribers a happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and can't wait to kick things back off in the new year, hopefully on a brighter note. But thanks again for watching. Thanks for stopping by, and we'll see you all in the new year.